Welcome to the therapy room. A place where psychology becomes understanding, and understanding becomes healing. I'm a psychologist passionate about bringing psychology closer to people in a way that feels human, emotional, cinematic, and deeply understandable. And today, we are talking about something that millions of people experience every single day, yet few people truly understand. Anxiety. Or more specifically, why anxiety never seems to leave. Why your mind never seems to stop. Why you can be physically exhausted and still find yourself awake at night, trapped inside thoughts that refuse to let you rest. And before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like your mind is your own worst enemy? Have you ever replayed the same conversation over and over again? Have you ever imagined a problem so many times that your body reacted as if it had already happened? If that sounds familiar, I want you to leave a comment below. Not because the algorithm likes comments, but because there is something powerful about realizing you are not alone. Sometimes anxiety convinces us that we are the only person struggling. The only person overthinking. The only person afraid. The only person who feels broken. But the truth is that millions of people carry the same invisible burden. And perhaps one of them is watching this video with you right now. So if any part of this conversation resonates with you, let me know in the comments. Tell me. What thought keeps returning to your mind? What is the worry that refuses to leave? Because today, we are going to explore why that happens. Not from the perspective of self-help. Not from the perspective of motivation. But from the perspective of psychology. And more specifically, through the work of a man named Aaron Beck. Aaron Beck spent much of his life studying a simple but fascinating question. Why do some people seem trapped inside worry? Why do some minds keep creating fear even when there is no immediate danger? Why can two people experience the exact same situation and walk away with completely different emotional reactions? One person loses sleep. The other moves on. One person feels overwhelmed. The other adapts. One person expects disaster. The other expects possibility. What creates the difference? For years, psychology searched for answers in childhood experiences, unconscious conflicts, and personality traits. Aaron Beck didn't reject those ideas. But he noticed something else. Something happening every minute of every day. Something so ordinary that most people never stop to examine it. Thoughts. Not just conscious thoughts. Automatic thoughts. The tiny mental messages constantly running through our minds. Messages that appear so quickly that we rarely notice them. Messages that quietly shape how we experience reality. Think about your own life. Have you ever received a message and immediately assumed something was wrong? Have you ever been invited to a meeting and instantly felt nervous? Have you ever noticed someone acting differently and immediately worried that you had done something wrong? Most people have. And that's because the human mind is constantly interpreting reality. We are meaning-making creatures. We don't simply experience life. We interpret life. And sometimes those interpretations create suffering. Imagine receiving a text message from someone you care about. Hours pass. No response. The anxious mind immediately begins working. Maybe they're upset with me. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe they don't want to talk anymore. Maybe the relationship is changing. Notice what happened. Nothing actually happened. No evidence appeared. No conflict occurred. Yet the body begins reacting. The stomach tightens. The chest feels heavy. The mind accelerates. The nervous system prepares for danger. This is one of the most important discoveries Aaron Beck ever made. Human beings often react less to events themselves and more to the stories they create about those events. And once you understand this, anxiety starts making much more sense. Because anxiety is not simply fear. Anxiety is anticipation. It is the mind's attempt to predict and control the future. The problem is that the future does not exist yet. And because it does not exist yet, the mind fills the empty space with imagination. sometimes hopeful imagination. But far more often, fearful imagination. This is why anxiety can feel so convincing. The future hasn't happened, yet your body already reacts as though it has. You imagine embarrassment. Your heart races. You imagine rejection. Your stomach twists. You imagine failure. Your confidence disappears. The event is imaginary. The emotional reaction is real. Aaron Beck became fascinated by this process, because he noticed that anxious people often had something in common. Their minds were constantly generating predictions. What if I fail? What if they reject me? What if something goes wrong? What if I lose everything? What if I embarrass myself? What if I'm not enough? Perhaps some of those questions sound familiar. Perhaps you've asked them yourself. The difficult thing about anxiety is that it often disguises itself as responsibility. It tells you that worrying is helping. It tells you that overthinking is preparation. It tells you that imagining disaster is keeping you safe. But is it? Think about all the things you've worried about in your life. How many actually happened? How many sleepless nights were spent preparing for disasters that never arrived? How many hours were lost to fears that never became reality? How many beautiful moments were interrupted by worries about a future that never came? If you're honest, probably more than you would like to admit. And that realization is important. Because anxiety often steals life before life even happens. It steals opportunities. It steals peace. It steals presence. It steals joy. Not because the danger is real, but because the fear feels real. And when fear feels real, the body responds. This is why so many anxious people feel exhausted. Not physically exhausted. Mentally exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. Spiritually exhausted. Because their mind never truly rests. Even when everything appears fine, the mind keeps searching. Scanning. Predicting. Preparing. Looking for threats. Looking for problems. Looking for reasons to worry. And perhaps you know exactly what that feels like. Perhaps you've experienced those moments when you finally solve one problem, only for your mind to immediately create another. One worry disappears. A new one arrives. One uncertainty resolves. Another uncertainty takes its place. It can feel endless. And that is because anxiety is rarely attached to a single problem. It is attached to a pattern. A pattern of thinking. A pattern of interpretation. A pattern of expecting danger. Aaron Beck realized that if we want to understand anxiety, we must understand the stories we tell ourselves. Because the stories become beliefs. The beliefs become emotions. The emotions become behaviors. And eventually the behaviors become our lives. This is why self-awareness is so powerful. Because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see. The first step is learning to notice. Notice the thoughts. Notice the predictions. Notice the assumptions. Notice the fears. Not judge them. Not fight them. Just notice them. And if you're still watching right now, I want to ask you another question. What is the thought that keeps returning to your mind lately? Is it about your future? Your health? Your finances? A relationship? A dream you're afraid to pursue? Leave a comment below. Because I think you'll be surprised by how many people are carrying the same fears. And sometimes healing begins the moment we realize we are not carrying them alone. Because anxiety thrives in isolation. But understanding creates connection. And connection creates hope. And hope is exactly where our journey continues. The strange thing about anxiety is that most people believe the problem is the things they worry about. But Aaron Beck discovered something surprising. The problem is often not the content of the worry. The problem is the process itself. Because once the brain learns to worry, it no longer needs a specific reason. It simply finds one. Have you ever noticed that? One problem gets solved. And almost immediately another appears. You finally receive the message you were waiting for. Relief lasts a few minutes. Then your mind finds something else. A health concern. A financial concern. A relationship concern. A future concern. It never ends. Because anxiety is not always attached to a particular problem. It becomes attached to uncertainty itself. And this is where many people become trapped. They spend years trying to eliminate every source of anxiety. Every possible fear. Every possible risk. Every possible uncertainty. But life doesn't work that way. The future remains uncertain. No matter how intelligent you are. No matter how prepared you are. No matter how much you think. And perhaps this is why overthinking becomes such a painful habit. Because overthinking creates the illusion of control. For a moment, it feels productive. It feels responsible. It feels as though you're doing something useful. But if overthinking truly worked, anxious people would be the calmest people in the world. Think about that. No one spends more time analyzing possibilities than an anxious mind. No one spends more time preparing for potential problems. No one spends more time mentally rehearsing the future. Yet despite all that effort, anxiety remains. Why? Because overthinking is not solving uncertainty. It is feeding uncertainty. Every question creates another question. Every answer creates another possibility. Every possibility creates another fear. And before long, the person is trapped inside a maze built entirely from thoughts. This is why some people describe anxiety as mental exhaustion. Not because life is physically demanding. But because the brain never stops working. Never stops calculating. Never stops predicting. Never stops preparing. Never stops asking. What if? What if I fail? What if I lose them? What if I embarrass myself? What if something goes wrong? What if I'm not enough? What if I'm falling behind? The questions never end. And perhaps one of the reasons anxiety is so common among intelligent people is that intelligent minds are exceptionally good at generating possibilities. The same imagination that creates creativity can create fear. The same intelligence that solves problems can create them. The same ability to think deeply can become the inability to stop thinking. Many highly intelligent people live inside their own minds. And when anxiety enters that environment, it finds unlimited material to work with. Every scenario becomes 10 scenarios. Every possibility becomes 20 possibilities. Every uncertainty becomes 1,000 questions. This is why anxiety often disguises itself as intelligence. The anxious mind believes, I'm just being realistic. I'm just being prepared. I'm just thinking ahead. But sometimes preparation becomes paralysis. Sometimes realism becomes pessimism. Sometimes thinking ahead becomes forgetting how to live in the present. Aaron Beck noticed another fascinating pattern. Anxious people often become experts at detecting danger. The problem is that they become equally skilled at ignoring safety. Think about your own life. How many times have you focused on one criticism while ignoring 10 compliments? How many times have you remembered one failure while forgetting 10 successes? How many times have you spent hours worrying about something that represented only a tiny fraction of reality? This process is called selective attention. The brain begins filtering reality. And anxiety teaches it to focus primarily on threats. Imagine wearing glasses that automatically highlight every possible danger while hiding every possible opportunity. That is what anxiety often feels like. The world becomes filled with risks, mistakes, problems, embarrassments, failures, potential disasters. And gradually, life begins feeling smaller. Not because the world became smaller. Because fear became larger. This is one reason social media has such a powerful effect on anxiety. Every day people are exposed to carefully edited versions of other people's lives. Success, beauty, confidence, achievement, adventure. Happiness. What they rarely see is fear, doubt, loneliness, insecurity, the panic attack in the middle of the night, the tears after everyone leaves, the uncertainty behind the smile. The anxious mind compares its reality to someone else's performance. And the comparison is always unfair. Because one side is real, the other side is curated. Yet anxiety treats the comparison as evidence. Evidence that everyone else is doing better. Evidence that everyone else is happier. Evidence that everyone else has figured life out. But they haven't. They're human too. They're afraid too. They're uncertain too. They're carrying struggles you cannot see. And perhaps that realization is important. Because anxiety often convinces people they are uniquely broken, uniquely flawed, uniquely incapable. But most of the struggles we believe are uniquely ours are shared by millions of people. The difference is that very few talk about them honestly. Another powerful fuel for anxiety is perfectionism. Many anxious people secretly believe they must perform flawlessly. Not because they enjoy perfection. Because they fear imperfection. They fear mistakes. They fear criticism. They fear rejection. They fear looking foolish. And because perfection is impossible, the anxiety never ends. There's always another standard to meet. Another flaw to fix. Another mistake to avoid. Another expectation to satisfy. Nothing feels enough. Success feels temporary. Achievement feels incomplete. The finish line keeps moving. And eventually life becomes exhausting. Aaron Beck understood that perfectionism is often fear wearing the mask of ambition. The perfectionist is not simply trying to succeed. They are trying to avoid feeling unworthy. But worthiness cannot be earned through flawless performance. Because human beings were never designed to be flawless. We learn through mistakes. We grow through failure. We evolve through discomfort. The anxious mind forgets this. It believes mistakes are evidence of inadequacy. But mistakes are evidence of humanity. And perhaps one of the most liberating realizations in psychology is that your value does not increase when you succeed. And it does not decrease when you fail. Your value remains. Even when you struggle. Even when you make mistakes. Even when you feel lost. Even when anxiety tells you otherwise. Because anxiety lies. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But convincingly. And the more convincing the lie, the more important it becomes to question it. This is why Aaron Beck's work remains so powerful. He taught people something simple. Yet life-changing. Just because your mind says something does not make it true. And once you truly understand that idea, everything begins to change. There comes a moment in the life of many anxious people when something subtle begins to happen. At first, anxiety feels like something you experience. Something that visits you. Something that appears during stressful moments. But over time, if anxiety stays long enough, the relationship changes. The person stops saying, "I feel anxious," and starts saying, "I am an anxious person." That difference may sound small. But psychologically, it changes everything. Because once anxiety becomes part of your identity, it becomes much harder to imagine life without it. Aaron Beck understood this deeply. He knew that human beings create stories about who they are. Stories that help them understand themselves. Stories that help them navigate the world. But sometimes those stories become prisons. The anxious person begins believing, "This is just who I am. I've always been this way. My brain doesn't work like other people's brains. I'll never change." And perhaps you've felt that way too. Perhaps you've spent so many years worrying that calm feels unfamiliar. Perhaps you've spent so many years preparing for danger that safety feels suspicious. Perhaps you've spent so much time living in survival mode that you can barely remember what peace feels like. If that's true, I want you to hear something very important. A pattern is not a personality. A habit is not an identity. An emotional response is not who you are. And what is learned can be changed. This is one of the most hopeful ideas in all of psychology. Because if anxiety was learned, healing can be learned too. Many people don't realize how much anxiety costs them. Not financially. Emotionally. Relationally. Existentially. Think about all the opportunities fear has stolen. The conversations never started. The relationships never pursued. The dreams postponed. The chances ignored. The risks avoided. The adventures delayed. The words left unsaid. Anxiety rarely destroys life dramatically. More often, it shrinks life quietly. One avoided opportunity at a time. One postponed dream at a time. One fearful decision at a time. Until eventually, the person looks back and realizes they were surviving instead of living. And perhaps that is anxiety's greatest theft. Not peace. Possibility. Because life becomes smaller when fear becomes larger. Aaron Beck dedicated his career to helping people reclaim that possibility. He understood that thoughts influence emotions. Emotions influence behavior. Behavior influences experience. And experience reinforces beliefs. This cycle can create suffering. But it can also create healing. Because if destructive patterns can be learned, healthier patterns can be learned as well. This became the foundation of cognitive therapy. One of the most effective psychological approaches ever developed. Not because it teaches people to ignore reality. Not because it teaches people to think positively all the time. But because it teaches people to think more accurately. To question assumptions. To examine evidence. To challenge automatic conclusions. To recognize that thoughts are not facts. Imagine how powerful that is. A thought appears. I'm going to fail. Instead of believing it automatically, you ask. What evidence supports that? A thought appears. They must be upset with me. You ask. What evidence supports that? A thought appears. I'm not good enough. You ask. What evidence supports that? And suddenly something changes. For the first time, the thought is no longer controlling you. You are examining it. Observing it. Questioning it. Creating distance from it. And in that distance, freedom begins. Because anxiety thrives when thoughts go unquestioned. But many anxious thoughts collapse under examination. Not because they are impossible. Because they are exaggerated. Distorted. Incomplete. Driven by fear rather than evidence. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. It doesn't mean fear disappears. It doesn't mean uncertainty vanishes. It means you stop giving fear complete authority over your decisions. And that changes everything. Perhaps the most important lesson Aaron Beck left us is this. The goal is not to eliminate every anxious thought. The goal is not to become fearless. The goal is not to create a perfectly silent mind. The goal is to change your relationship with your thoughts. To stop treating every fear as a prophecy. To stop treating every uncertainty as a threat. To stop treating every uncomfortable feeling as danger. Because a mind that never stops can learn to slow down. A nervous system trapped in survival mode can learn safety. A person who has spent years preparing for disaster can learn to trust moments of peace. Not overnight. Not instantly. But gradually. One thought at a time. One breath at a time. One day at a time. And perhaps that's exactly what someone watching this video needed to hear today. Maybe your mind has been racing lately. Maybe you've been carrying fears nobody else can see. Maybe you've spent years believing anxiety was simply who you are. If so, remember this. You are not your anxiety. You are not your worst thoughts. You are not your fears. You are not the catastrophic stories your mind creates at 3 o'clock in the morning. You are the awareness observing those thoughts. You are the person listening to them. And because you are the observer, you are not trapped by them. Aaron Beck spent his life helping people discover this truth. The same brain that learned fear can learn safety. The same mind that learned anxiety can learn calm. The same person who feels trapped today can feel free again. And if you've made it this far in the video, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me. What is one thought you struggle with most often? What is one fear that keeps returning? You might discover that thousands of people are carrying the same burden. And if this conversation helped you understand yourself a little better, subscribe to the channel. Here at the Therapy Room, we explore psychology, emotional healing, relationships, trauma, anxiety, human behavior, and the hidden forces shaping our lives. Because understanding creates awareness. Awareness creates freedom. And freedom creates the possibility of change. Thank you for spending this time with me. And remember, sometimes the most important conversation you'll ever have is the one happening inside your own mind. Until next time, take care of yourself.